Well, good evening. I'm Bob Graves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. And as we begin tonight, I want to wish each of you a wonderful holiday season, and also let you know that I'm not going to be here on Wednesday night. I'm going to be with my family and having a good time, and I'd encourage you to do that too if that's an option for you. So there won't be an unconventional pastor show on Wednesday, unless Joey feels like throwing up a recording of a previous show. That for those of you who've got nothing else to do, that'd be something that would be interesting. Anyhow, so I won't be here on Wednesday. But tonight, something that has been on my mind even for a couple of weeks here, and my wife and I were even talking about this earlier today, is taking a look at the past of the mixed messages that we have from our Christian background, taking a look at the history that exists in the claims that people have made about God. And the question that my wife and I were talking about, and that I've even been thinking about quite a bit, is, isn't it amazing how it is possible that people are not willing to or open to questioning some of the things that we have just accepted? We used to. I remember there was a time in my life when I used to wonder, well, how do I know if I'm really saved? What if I'm not really saved? What if it's not? What if it didn't really take? Should I maybe ask Jesus into my heart again? Am I still struggling with sin because I'm not genuinely converted, or is it possible that there's just some other things I got to work with, or what's going on here? And this question of one's salvation. And during all of this time, when a lot of people go through that, it rarely occurs to you, what sort of God has got you under the gun where this is the kind of thing you even need to worry about or wonder about and can't find clarity on? It just, it's a strange thing. In other words, we accept the duress of the potential consequences without really questioning the validity of them. And that's an unfortunate and strange thing. And I think that it's particularly strange given some of the things that we talk about. I made a comment on Facebook a while back that, I wish I could grab that comment, where maybe I could find it later if I look for it. Basically, though, where I was talking about, we talk about God as if he's the head of some criminal organization. We talk about him as somebody who's making us an offer we can't refuse, somebody who is promising us, as it were, protection and safety from a horrific possibility that might come our way under the authority of no one else but him. And so there's a sense in which God is really, the way he's often talked about, offering us salvation from what it is he plans to do to us if we're not measuring up. And I can't think of any relationship where that works without destroying the integrity of the development of the person in that relationship. Now, some people might argue that, well, hey, he's God and you're just a human being. Well, that argument doesn't work for me, and I'll tell you why. I'm a human being, and he's God. One thing I've learned is that children are children. They're not adults. And as a result, when you relate to children, you can't relate to them as if they were adults. My wife's a nanny, and I'll tell you one of the things I've been impressed with her, if I can brag on her a bit. she's been a nanny for several different families by now. Her first family, she was with them for like about 14 years. The next family, I can't remember, 5, 6, whatever. Then another family for about 3 or 4. And she's now with another family that she just started with about a year ago. No, it was only like half a year ago. But anyhow, as she's done this, she relates to these kids so awesomely. And you can see this. One of the things that you learn when you're talking to a child is if you really want to connect to them, you kneel down, as it were. You get on their level. You don't talk down to them, particularly if you're hoping to help this child, deal with something or to understand you or to have to accept something. When you come to them from this adult level where you just have control and power over them, you'll get your way, but you're actually building something up in that child that is going to come back at you one day in a way it is not going to be good. And to respect that child involves dealing with the child at the level the child is at. And I would expect that this is something that God of all entities should know. That if he's going to deal with us, he really does have to deal with us at our level. And in a sense, this fear of what he can do to our bodies and our souls and the suffering and for eternity, that there is something about this that is a little bit overwhelming, to the point that I think this is what destroys our sense of clarity and honesty that keeps us from being able to ask these questions. The question is, what kind of a God is that? It just doesn't make sense. And I think that we need to be willing to ask many more questions in terms of the kind of a gospel that we accept as somehow a gospel of a so-called holy God. And some of the contradictions that we would run into. Now, I understand there's a lot of people out there who want to defend the Bible and say, well, there's no contradictions in the Bible, and none of that. But I'll also concede the fact that there are a ton of, you go to websites, you say, contradictions in the Bible, and you Google it, and you'll find many, many contradictions that are asserted to exist, that when you take a closer look, you discover that if you talk to somebody who's really more informed about the text, you discover that these aren't necessarily contradictions. Sometimes people just don't understand the complexity of the story, and so So I'm not saying that the Bible is just loaded with contradictions, although I do think that there are some contradictions there. The point I'm trying to make is this: there are some contradictions of reason that strike me as standing out far more than oh, in this verse it said there were 27,000, and over in this verse in a different chapter talking about the same incident it says 26,000, where there's a discrepancy here of 1,000. Okay, so all right, so there's the textual discrepancy. Big deal. I don't think people back then could actually count 26,000 people accurately anyway. So it's like, big deal. That's not the problem. But I do see a larger problem when we see a story that is brought to us of, well, for one thing, in the New Testament, when Paul is talking to us about love, and he says love is patient and love is kind. And then we see the story of the Garden of Eden. And Adam and Eve told not to eat something. And in the story, they do. They ate something they were not supposed to eat. And what's the consequence of this? I can't understand, where's the patience? where's the kindness? Where's this absence of jealousy? Where's this not acting unbecomingly? I don't know. It's not ringing out for me. Now, I don't have a problem with the story of the garden because, first of all, I see it as being a parable of sort, an analogy, a metaphor, and I really don't think that it's a story that was ever intended for us to take apart point by point and get an absolutely clear spiritual message out of every aspect of it. I see it more, to be honest with you, as a myth with a point, and a useful point, but that it's just been taken to an extreme that I just don't think it was ever intended to have been taken to. Long before Christianity ever got a hold of it as well, but we don't ask ourselves this question, where does this consistency that we're talking about in terms of who is this God come from? There are other things that I remember, the very first time I ever read through the Bible from cover to cover, and I've done that a number of times. I'd be honest with you, I didn't have any problem with anything. God does something horrifyingly terrific and powerful. It's like, ooh, oh my goodness, you better snap to. This is someone worth, obeying. And I think the closest I ever came to not, to not accepting it was, I remember one time I was in my office in Utica, New York, preparing a message that I was going to be preaching, and reading through some of the Old Testament things that happened and the consequences that followed. And I remember falling to my knees and saying, God, sometimes you just seem way too hard, and praying about it. But at the same time, I was struggling to accept it. When now, as I look back at it, I read some of those verses now, I find myself greatly questioning either the validity of the story, or if that's the point of the story, and I'm just trying to read something very horrific into it, or that the story may have existed for some other purpose, or that it's really just a story, But the question certainly is worthy to be asked, and we tend to not ask it. I think of a couple of other things that when I've read about them, that at first it didn't bother me, but that now when I look back at it, I find that it not only bothers me, but it bothers me in a way that I find has even modern relevance. For example, are we to believe that in 1 Chronicles 21 that God actually endorsed the idea of 60 cities being totally destroyed, man, woman, and child, destroyed so that the Israelites could have a home? When do we realize that is this not ethnic cleansing of some sort? Is this not genocide of some sort? Now, am I to believe and somehow endorse the idea that, God found that all of those inhabitants of the land were corrupt and evil, and so he needed to squash them and kill them? So much for love is patient and love is kind. So much for love keeps no record of wrong. I don't understand where the responsible parenting of God comes in that story. But also, if God had a problem with those people, well, there's later a time when we read where David holds the census. King David holds a census, and God was kind of all displeased about the census that David had. And so he comes to David and has him confronted and gives him a choice of what consequence he wants to suffer. And as an end result of that, 70,000 people die. Of course, I'm wondering, how do they know 70,000 people died? Did they take another census? But who are these people who died? 70,000 people died because David did something he shouldn't have done, and we're okay with this, and this is not a problem. Well, the interesting thing about that in this story is that when God brings this consequence to David, God is evidently the one that kills these 70,000 people, or the angel of the Lord, or whatever. And so, God does the dirty work as well. But when we're looking at these 60 cities, these are people under the ban, as it were. But who's asked to do the dirty work? The very same people who have been told, "Thou shalt not kill." I'm looking for what strikes me as a contradiction of philosophy, of a contradiction of reasonableness, of a contradiction of trying to find, how do you put these two things together? How do they work? And I'll tell you, it is this kind of a question that has caused me to come to the Bible in a very, very different way. I don't reject it, but rather what I see in it are people who are using God as a way of both trying to justify themselves and trying to find a way of transcending their circumstances and situations. I see it as kind of a mixed bag, something very right and something very wrong going on all at the same time. And that's not entirely surprising. I look back at my own life, and when I look at my younger self, I'm looking at a younger man who was doing a lot of things right and a lot of things wrong all at once. Very, very confused about a number of things in many ways, and so, it was a difficult thing, and so I certainly am not one to be judging my fellow man from days gone by, but I certainly am not going to take a look at these stories and say, oh, okay, well, God was doing all these things and he was absolutely right in doing them, and indeed it really was God doing these things. I see here a nation struggling for identity, struggling for solidarity, struggling for stability, struggling for civility, and taking some rather radical actions to achieve it, and recognizing, this is important, they didn't just go in there and kill people in these 60 cities. They didn't say, well, hey, we want the place, and we got enough of an army, we're going to do it. They didn't do that. They knew better than to do that. They knew that that would be wrong. They were able to do this because they had convinced themselves God had called them to do this. I think it's an important part of it. I think this shows us how religion for us can become the way in which we wiggle around with the notion of God to justify some of the horrific things that we could otherwise never justify. And this is important to see that. But that at the same time, we do this because we're struggling to find the one we seem to know is there. And I finally got to the point myself where I saw that this was this is why I call it the cult of Yahweh. That I see that these were people struggling. And that I do believe that God did come to them, but that he came to them in a way where they were able to get a glimpse, but not a clear glimpse. And that it's as if God actually infiltrates their faith, their understanding, and that man throughout the entire earth was given to this concept of authority and power and consequence and violence. And so, the only way to begin this trek for them was violently, unfortunately. But that by the time Jesus comes, we're now ready to take this up to a very different level, a level that is now getting ready to shed all of the hypocrisy, all of the self-service, all of the things that we have said are wrong, all the things that we have said are right. We need to start to put this together in a way that has far more integrity, far more going for it. Now, when it goes back to these 60 cities, this is something I find very contemporary You see, this is a nation that supposedly came into existence by taking a land they clearly admit wasn't theirs. They say God gave it to them. And so they went in and they took it by force. And there was a great deal of death, a great deal of mayhem, a great deal of violence. And what I seem to know about human beings, just as what they are biologically and psychologically, I can't even begin to imagine what this would have done to the people who actually participated in the sort of deeds that brought that about. But nonetheless, this is their story. This is what they're saying they're doing. And a lot of people don't know this, but I mean, it's there for you to know, but a lot of people don't think about it. And that is that, they became a nation that was in some ways a little bit disorganized, ruled by judges and a little bit too loosely organized. So they wanted a king. And then they got one in Saul. And that didn't work out so well. And then they ended up with a far better king, a national hero, a person that in many ways they could admire and like, a man who was in many ways a very likable and winsome and spiritually minded person in David. But he also was quite a warrior. And so David was their king. And then his son, Solomon, becomes their king upon David's death. And Solomon, but he takes it a little bit too far, rules a little bit too rigidly, and then his son Rehoboam comes along, and people saying, they come to him saying, hey, it got a little rough there. We're hoping that you're gonna, your administration is gonna take a slightly different approach to how to manage some of these affairs, because I'm telling you, this is killing us. And Rehoboam's response was, you will find my little finger thicker than my father's waist. And basically he's saying, hey, I got the power, and boy, are you going to know it. And what happened? The nation split. Now, here's something I think is interesting to note. What was the name of the northern split of those 10 tribes? That nation came to be known as Israel. The lower nation, where the biblical record for the most part then continues, and that those people from whom we find Jesus finally coming from, this was the tribe of Judah. Benjamin also got absorbed into them, and of course the Levites that were among them. But we basically have 2 1/6 of all of Israel in Judah, not all of Israel. And so they become 2 separate countries, with 2 different kings, 2 different leaders. And it continues on that way for some time until finally the northern 10 tribes kind of disappear. They have no idea really what happened to them. And the southern tribes, and here's something that a lot of people forget and don't seem to realize. The southern tribes, they're not Israel. The nation split. And Israel was the name of the northern set of them. And Judah was just a minor part of it. It would be kind of like, if the United States were ever to one day fall apart, and most of the states just end up disappearing, and only New York State remains there. New York State is not the United States of America. It's just New York State. Just in the same way, Judah is not Israel. Well, Israel disappeared. And then eventually Judah fell apart. And when Judah fell apart and was carried away into Babylon, according to their story, what a lot of people forget to put back into context is this. That was the last time that anyone called Israel or anyone called Judah ever had any real control in that area of the globe. Ever. In fact, they were not only in Babylon, but when they came back in the days of Ezra, they didn't come back to take leadership there. They were still an occupied people. They weren't free. They just were able to come back physically to the land. And then after, the Persian Empire falls apart, Alexander the Great comes through. And then they were still an occupied people, occupied by the Greeks. And when the Greek Empire falls apart and the Roman Empire comes through, they were still an occupied people. And then in 70 AD, they end up disappearing entirely. They're gone. And they're, the diaspora, they're just all over the place. And diaspora, they're just all over the place. And then there's a day when, and I can understand this, when the Zionist movement comes along, these are people who are really without a land, and they would like to get their land back. But here's the thing that I think a lot of people lose sight of. This is Judah we're talking about. We have no idea where Israel is. We only know where Judah is. We only know where the descendants of Judah are. And Judah goes back, and again, they try to take the place by force. Now, they do make a couple of what I consider to be inappropriate, unrealistic offers that, of course, were not going to work out. And they knew that when they were going back in, that there was going to be trouble. And to be honest with you, I think the United States and Great Britain wanted that trouble, because we knew that the new country of Israel would never, ever succeed without promised military aid. And that made certain that we would always have a military presence there. I got to be honest with you, I don't see it as a genuine offer. But I also see it as a little bit dishonest in this. What if the United States of America was to one day fall apart, and there was this prophecy that we would come back together, and they're all gone except for New York State, and then one day New York State disappears, and the people who are the citizens of New York State are the only people we actually continue to keep track of, and then one day the descendants of the New York people come back, and then they want to occupy the entire former United States of America and say, we're the United States of America. And they take more than just New York. Is that really... And supposedly, if there was, say, a prophecy that all of the United States would come back, well, where are all these other people that were part of the United States, their descendants? Where are they? I would want to suggest that we don't know where the lost 10 tribes of Israel are, but I don't know. I think it's highly likely that a lot of them are still there. And I don't know, maybe that's who the Palestinians are. Maybe they are Israel. And Judah has taken over as if Israel. I think we've created a very, very difficult situation there. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be there. I don't know what the solution to this problem is. I think it's a very serious problem. And but I am saying this: we have not been honest in how we've been telling this story. We haven't put it together right, even though this is the information we have from a biblical record. Shows me the kind of fooling around we are willing to do with the text and able to justify what's going on. And that bothers me. I really think that part of the reason we can do that is because we already did it when we accepted that some of the very evil things that are being done in the name of God or being attributed to God here are the things that we have learned to accept. Evidently, it's like, where does a 500-pound gorilla sleep? Anywhere he wants to. Well, that may be true, but that doesn't make the 500-pound gorilla a nice guy. Where does the God of heaven get to exhibit and manifest his power? Well, I suppose anywhere he wants to, but that doesn't make him a very nice guy. I mean, when Isaiah said, who has been his counselor? I don't know. Am I supposed to look at that as a cry for help? That God has issues and nobody can help him? I don't know. It's striking me as we need to take a look at this text. We need to take a look at this heritage. And I'm not suggesting that we throw it away, but I am suggesting that we take a look at it and understand that what we find in here is a trajectory of something that eventually brings to us Christ. And Christ says that, as he's come, he comes at a time when they say, no man has ever really seen the Father. And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And we're seeing a person here who, other than the way we've even then distorted it by trying to turn the church back into another form of the theocracy of Israel, which was just absurd for the so-called church to have done. We see in Jesus a very, very different story of who is God. And there comes a point in our lives where I think we're going to have to be honest that there's a contradiction of reason here. There's a contradiction of character. There's a contradiction of love. There's a contradiction of what's right and wrong. I guarantee you that if we were to ever see anybody do some of the things that Israel claimed they were authorized by God to do today, that we would consider that nation to be war criminals or evil. And I would even want to suggest that sometimes the way we've allowed even Israel to behave in dealing with this genuine conundrum, for which I don't really have a simple and easy solution, where we think, well, whatever it is, we have to support them because, God will bless those who bless Israel and God will curse those who curse Israel. And I would want to suggest, first of all, I think that was a national statement. I don't think it's really a statement that God is going to stand by. But let's pretend for a moment that it is. Let's say that God really will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. Well, Judah isn't Israel. Israel is Israel. And where's Israel? Nobody knows. But how do you know you're not cursing them? This is a question I don't think we're ready to ask ourselves honestly. Anyway, this takes me back to the question of the God that we see revealed in Christ. I think we see in the New Testament this trajectory continuing on, but in a whole new way. When Paul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, this is something unusual that is going on here. And who was Paul? Paul was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was an up-and-coming promised son. He was someone we expected was going to do great things. Sat at the feet of Gamaliel. He was probably, voted the most likely to succeed. A radically promising person. And then he sees this movement called, these followers of Christ, and he's really upset about what it is they're doing. He doesn't like what they're teaching. He doesn't like what it's doing to the faith that he holds dear. And he starts to go about justified in creating mayhem and death in the lives of these people who believe in Christ. And he's trying to, at least he's trying to do it legally, but he's really a murderous person. He wants these people dead, and he's going to do whatever he can to make sure they come to an end. And he's on his way on the road to Damascus, and he runs into this bright light, And the interesting thing is that although the bright light confronts him, Paul, it's a little hard for you to kick against the goads, there is this moment of confrontation. But as the moment moves on, I find two things interesting here. First of all, Paul's reaction to this is, first of all, he knows this is God. But he's also a little bit confused. Why do you persecute me? And he's a little bit confused. He's thinking, what are you talking about? He thought of himself, probably up until that moment in time, as an excellent servant of God. A lot of people think that, I imagine. But he thought of himself that way. And then I can't imagine. Can you imagine what it would have been like to have been Paul in just that very moment? First of all, he believes in a God that justifies vindication. He believes in a God that justifies murder. He believes in a God that justifies all of the evil he would like to be doing to these Christians. He believes in that God. And now he's meeting this bright light that he recognizes as to be God. And then he finds out this God's name is Jesus. He must have been the first person to ever say that name out in a way that was inappropriate. Jesus. Oh my goodness, who are you? What a shock. But as soon as Paul comes to that point where he knows who this is, the moment Paul knows who it is, Jesus is really done with this being an issue. It's not an issue. From there on out, Jesus isn't saying, so what have you been doing? Are you going to stop this? No. Jesus, in his understanding, is really going to turn this around. And Paul leaves this moment having met the very God whose followers he's been murdering. And instead of experiencing the vindication and the wrath and the consequences of the powers that be, off with his head and all that other stuff, he's commissioned. I got a job for you to do. And I can't imagine how he couldn't have, he must have realized, have I earned this? And yet at the same time, it's not a foolish thing for God to be doing this. Why would God do something foolish? Paul has got this conundrum he has to work with. He's got to reconcile the concepts of God that he had prior to this moment with the concept of God he has to have now as a result of this moment. Now, prior to this, he sat at the feet of Gamaliel. He read the scriptures. He had concepts. He had ideas. But now he's actually met Jesus. And this is different. It's one thing to have thoughts about somebody you never met. It's another thing to meet them, actually have an encounter with them about something very relevant going on in your life, and then leave that encounter trying to make sense of it all. It's a very different thing. And so Paul is doing that. Paul comes away from that moment radically changed because he knows he experienced a response from Christ that was accepting, that was loving, that was encouraging, that was redemptive. And he's got to make sense of all this. And he brings this message that he brings out. And I really see that in Paul, and a lot of people don't want to see this, but I see as Paul progresses through his ministry, this vision of who Jesus really is and the grace and the love of God is something that becomes clearer to him as time goes on. And it takes time for some of the attitudes and insights and ways of thinking to kind of transform. But Paul talks about this transformation, even like in places like we find in Romans 12, where he says, it's our spiritual service to be, that we present ourselves and that we're, that the renewing of our minds. So he's been going through this, which is why he's talking about it. He's thinking differently every day. He's not just somebody who came to know Jesus and now he knows everything and he's just going to take some time to pontificate it to us. He's in this process of discovery. There's things I'm understanding today I didn't know yesterday. And there's things I preached yesterday that I really can't preach today. And there's things I'm preaching today that no doubt tomorrow I'll discover I can't preach that anymore. He discovered this forward movement that he was involved in by knowing Jesus, and he finds himself on a completely different trajectory. And eventually it leads to these amazing words that we find in 1 Corinthians 13, where I think that Paul actually expresses it in some ways a very clear sense of what's really going on in the way he contrasts that which he now considered dung for the excellency of knowing Christ. His previous past faith and religion and his principles and what he thought was true and the character of God that he believed in, this is all stuff he no longer wants anything to do with. He's done with it. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons why I think it's important to not throw out the Bible in a sense. In here, we find the history of a movement that starts in the dark, that starts justifying itself with this belief in God. And it works its way to a point where God actually does really come to them in the form of Jesus. And unfortunately, Christian history is a lot of trying to rebuild the old back into the new, because the new is something perhaps we find at this point in time scary, risky. We're not sure of it. Or people who wanted control and power and to continue to manipulate us have so confused the issue that we haven't taken the time to ask these important questions. Does this really make sense? Does it really make sense? Aren't there a lot of good questions we can ask about what's going on? They strike me as reasonable questions. We think about things such as, love is patient. Now, as I would talk about love being patient, I certainly can't tell you that all my life I've been a patient man. I haven't. People who have known me, I'm 61 years old, people who've known me for a long time, the farther back in my life you go, the more you can find people who can say, Bob Greaves, patient? I don't think so. And yet I have had to learn from the example of what love is, what patience is, why it's so wise, why it's so meaningful, why it works so well, why it's so commendable, why it's such a worthy goal. And patience isn't even a form of endurance. Patience is a joy. Patience is something where you begin to be arrested so much by the value of what can really emerge in the person with whom you're being patient that you wouldn't want to miss that. No. The impatience would kind of kill it, and you don't want to do that. Patience is not just a way of being nice. It's a way of investing in what's really worthwhile. Love is kind. We see the value of kindness. We see it at work. We know the way we have responded at times when we've received a kindness, whether it was a kindness that recognized our value and our worth as a human being, or even a kindness that we received that we weren't necessarily in a place where we'd earned it, as it were. But we know the redemptive quality of kindness. Love is not jealous. This is one of the reasons why I say I don't really have that much of an agenda. Part of the reason I'm doing this show, in fact, is because I was asked to. I'm searching this out. I'm not interested in persuading people to think the way I do. I'm sharing what I'm thinking because it might be of use to you. And if it isn't, that's fine. You don't have to buy into a thing I say. I'm not asking you to. In fact, you really shouldn't. If anything I say helps you in your own process in taking responsibility for the way you think, that's great. And if you let go of your own responsibility to think for yourself by thinking the way I do, I don't want you doing that. That isn't right. You can't do that. It isn't going to work. And when he said, you just need to take responsibility for yourself in the way that we all need to do that. Looking at other things that Paul had found by the time he gets to where he's able to write 1 Corinthians 13, love does not act unbecomingly. That's a big one because we can all have a different idea as to what love ought to do, what love ought not to do. Love can sometimes be stern and strict. Love can sometimes draw a line, but it draws a line not because it's protecting its own. It's drawing a line for the sake and the value of the person who needs to know there's a line here. There's a way of drawing a line that's redemptive. A person who violates your boundaries, they need to know there's a boundary here, and there's a way of drawing that line, drawing that boundary with them that is firm, maybe even with consequences, but all designed for them to learn where that boundary is so they can respect it. One of the reasons why I have boundaries, and I'm usually pretty good at maintaining my boundaries, is because I actually want my boundaries to be open. I just want you to know that when you're inside my boundaries, I expect you to act like a guest. And I expect myself to behave like a guest when I'm in a place where the intimacy and closeness I have with you is inside your boundaries. So, love can be at times tough. It can be at times difficult. It can involve discipline. It's not all good stuff. Pleasant stuff. It's not all easy stuff. It's not all nice and syrupy stuff. But, love doesn't behave unbecomingly. Love does what it does. You know what? Even when we're immature, even when our ideas are not really as valid as we think they are, love really wants to do what's best for the other person. Even if you don't really know what's best, even if what you do isn't what is best, at least love, when it's immature, is trying to do that and cares about that. And that's very different. And I see that in Paul now. Even I see this in the trajectory of Paul when he's going through some of the things he's learning to let go of. Once he meets Christ, he discovers this powerful love that is very difficult to make sense of at first. It is a real contradiction to his past religious faith. But he does find himself getting to that point where even if he's not perfect, even if he doesn't understand it perfect, he really wants what he does to be that which is truly at least motivated by a genuine and honest desire to be for the best, win-win for everyone involved. Now, love does not seek its own. And if God is love, God cares more about whether or not you're growing, whether or not you are healthy and developing. He cares more about that than whether you understand He is the one worthy of your gratitude. He's not interested in being the star because his ego needs the boost or the soothing, or because he has no time or patience for these people who just don't understand that he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's not one of these snooty kind of things. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. Love does not take into account the wrongs suffered. It doesn't keep a record of wrongs. Now, this is not because wrongs don't matter. Wrongs do matter. I'm not saying God isn't interested in taking up some issues with us. I'm just saying that, when you do something wrong, God is more concerned about what you're going to learn from this than you did something wrong, you creep, you low life piece of garbage. That's absurd. When you see your own child, maybe you can relate to this if your parent do something wrong. You want them to learn something that would be better to do. You're not. If you love that child, you're not focused on the fact that now that I see this, I know you're not perfect. I don't know if I can like you anymore. That's not the thing you're going to be doing. It's not that there aren't things that we can grow into, not that there's not development we need to go through. The thing is this: the failures those are just relevant parts of our history, but they're not the issue. That's not the important thing. We can't deny them. It's not honest to recognize. It's not honest to feel that we shouldn't make some of these changes, or shouldn't grow, or shouldn't move forward towards maturity, moving on. Of course, but at the same time, the fact that we are in development is not a problem, and it is not the issue. And love is not focused on that. And this is something that Paul learned. Because, I mean, look at the mistakes he was making, thinking he was doing the right thing back when he's killing Christians. And along comes Jesus and talks to him. And finally, as soon as we understand what's going on here, what are we getting? We're getting, he's just, I got to take a look at this message here. What is he getting? He's just getting grace and welcoming from Christ. A viewer comment, and we're going to have to then end with this. Patience comes from being arrested time and time again by love. And people who get arrested time and time again require a lot of love and patience. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah. In fact, we got to love that criminal element in each of us. Yeah, okay, that's probably from Joey, I bet you. Anyhow, I wanted to talk about this, I want to encourage us to ask these questions and not be afraid of the answers, and not be afraid of the trip it can lead us through, and not be afraid of the way we might feel like we're losing God. You can't lose him. Might feel like you do. But I do think that I see in Paul this example of a real shift of trajectory. And I see in the promise of the gospel and of the promise of the Christian message a totally different direction than some of this religiosity. And so we don't want to build this religiosity back into Christianity. We want to take this new message of Christ, this new relationship, and we want to see if this can take us even farther. Anyhow, that's all we have to say. I won't see you again then, perhaps until next week. But until then, this is Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor. Thank you for listening.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was the Unconventional Pastor, Bob Greaves. Always a wonderful conversation. Stay tuned. In just a few minutes, Dr. Michael W. Jones and Rhonda Jones will be on stage to start it up again.